Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the sessions. And we will begin today with a very exciting session this morning. Today we are going to hear from some of the very inspiring global young leaders who will share their stories and talk about their journey to global leadership. And before we begin, I would like to remind you and encourage you to keep the conversation alive on social media. Yesterday we had 3,000 impressions on Twitter. Congratulations. 300,000. Today we would like to have 3 million, okay? And yesterday we were trending in Latin America. Let's make sure that today we are trending in Africa, in Asia, and even in faraway places like Australia. So we will start with this first speaker. I would like to introduce Sam Vagar. Sam Vagar is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Millennium Campus Network, convening and training the next generation of social impact leaders on university campuses. Under Sam's leadership, the MCN trains over 1,000 campus leaders annually through its global conference, the Millennium Fellowship, and the global campaigns. After meeting with the President Barack Obama in the White House in 2011, Sam traveled to 4 nations on speaking tours to share MCN for the US Department of State. He was selected for the 2012 list of the top 99 most influential foreign policy leaders under the age of 33 by the Diplomatic Career and Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. Through his talks on youth leadership and social impact, Sam has directly engaged over 25,000 people at over 100 institutions worldwide, including talks at Harvard University, MIT, the White House, and the United Nations. In addition to leadership with MCM, Sam serves as an advisor to the Executive Director of UN Women, as one of the 12 members worldwide of her advisory group. Sam, the floor is yours.
I am inspired. I'm inspired by this extraordinary group of people, by all of you, by the space that we're in, and the remarks that I heard yesterday. Hearing you, Kevin, talk about the work in Toronto and how we humanize the facts and the stories of Amy and John. Hearing you, Sienna, talk about your family and your courage and your mom's courage and always making the ask and asking for help. And I don't have to look that far. I'm surrounded by leaders. Xenia to my right, Alejandra right behind me. It has been an extraordinary time to be with you all here at the Vatican, at Casino Pio. I'm blown away. Monsignor Sanchez, Dr. Betsy Parker, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, Dr. Sonia Sachs, Dr. Tony Annett, Sam Lonnie, my brother, Anastasia, John, the entire team at SDSN Youth, as well as Gabriela Marino, Federica Petrini, incredible team here. And I was thinking about this. It's not just us in this room, it's everybody who's watching. So all of you, all around the world, who are tuning in, who are a part of the live stream, Mom, Dad, I made it. Mom and Dad, Cyrus, LJ, Raina, Abigail, all of my colleagues, everyone who supported us, not just me, but this is about solidarity. And for each of us who is here today, there are a lot of people who support us to enable us to be here today. So to all of you, thank you for all that you do. My name is Sam Vagar, and I serve as the Executive Director of Millennium Campus Network, MCN, a global student network helping to address humanity's greatest challenges. I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts. In reflecting upon the theme of our symposium, the focus on our role as stewards of our planet for a more fraternal and supportive society, I affirm the insight shared by Monsignor Sanchez and by Dr. Annett that, quote, the current crisis is a crisis of values. If that is the problem threatening us, then I submit that the values we must affirm, empathy, humility, inclusion, are those that uphold dignity in our interactions with people and planet. A major force for shifting values is youth leaders committed to justice. As Pope Francis conveys to the world in Laudato Si, quote, young people demand change. They wonder how anyone can claim to be building a better future without thinking of the environmental crisis and the sufferings of the excluded. I've come to realize this truth, that youth leaders are willing to stand up for what is right and often have throughout history. We can study how the bold Ella Baker and young colleagues like Charlie Cobb and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee came together to help tackle segregation and uphold civil rights in the United States. We can point to the remarkable role that young leaders, including Nelson Mandela, a leader who began his activism in his youth, played in ending apartheid. And in the mid-1980s in my country, the United States, 155 campuses mobilized to divest from South Africa during apartheid, helping to shift national and international public opinion on this injustice. History makes it clear. Youth alone do not change the world. Youth alone do not change the world. Intergenerational social movements that embrace youth leadership do. And so I come to the Vatican at this precarious time to share the message we all know to be true and must conclusively prove, that it is time to make a sizable investment in youth leadership, that convenings like this symposium matter, and that it is up to us inside and outside of this room to build upon this foundation, to ensure that every young person advancing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, every young leader far beyond this venue, has the support they need to carry out this shared work. And this isn't just a wish, a pipe dream. This is a mandate directly from the UN. It's clearly defined in SDG 4.7 that by 2030, all learners acquire the knowledge and skills to promote sustainable development. So as you asserted at this symposium last year, Professor Sachs, the precise support needed for youth leaders to meaningfully engage must be clearly defined. And then we, all of us as advocates, must be indefatigable in advocating for it. My journey into this space began at 19 years old. I read 2 books that changed my life. The first was Mountains Beyond Mountains, about Dr. Paul Farmer and Partners in Health. The second was The End of Poverty by economist Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. It was the final section of that book that spoke to me, a clear blueprint for what we as individuals could do to meaningfully engage with the world's poorest communities. I put down the book, picked up the phone, and cold called Professor Sachs. 2 days later, I was in New York meeting with your team. What is remarkable and still astounds me to this day is that you and your team, Professor Sachs, would give me the time of day. I was a young student at Brandeis University, wide-eyed and ingenuous, and you were willing to engage and mentor me. You saw the value in me as a potential young leader in this social movement, as you see in every young leader in this room today, and in thousands more you personally engage with across the globe. Thank you for believing in me when it mattered most and for embracing youth leadership. You're in many ways the reason that we're here, and so I want to invite all of you to join me in thanking Professor Sachs. So we went on to host our first global conference at MIT in 2008 with 1,000 young leaders, with Professor Sachs, Dr. Farmer, John Legend, and more. These leaders joined our board of advisors and helped us launch the Millennium Campus Network, or MCN. A decade into this journey, we have connected and trained over 5,500 undergraduates committed to social impact from 300 universities around the world. Undergraduates like Nisha McCrae, who used our training and took her engineering prowess from MIT to create a do-it-yourself solar power USB charger for mobile devices. She convenes teens in Cape Town, South Africa, and Boston, Massachusetts to assemble the chargers. Nisha then invites the teens to submit their own designs in pitch competitions. She has turned her organization, Bajika, from a student venture into a full-time organization and trained 1,000 youth so far, helping young people tap into their entrepreneurial abilities to help chart their own futures. Nisha's story is just one of 5,500 in our alumni community to date. In every country I've traveled, and in most personal interactions I've had, young leaders have two requests, and I imagine many of you can guess what they are, because we've all made them. And those two requests are funding and jobs. Just by a show of hands, how many people here have had those requests to somebody for the work you do? Yeah, so me too. And here's what we found. There are 1.8 billion youth ages 15 to 24, and north of 100 million university students in the world today. No single organization could secure funding for every promising youth-led initiative and jobs for every young leader. And so at MCN, we look to root causes, to the gaps that, if addressed, would enable more undergraduate leaders, in particular, to be better positioned to leverage funding and secure social sector jobs for themselves. We identified three gaps: a lack of training, a lack of connections, and a lack of recognition. And so our newest programming model that we plan to embark on in 2018 centers on addressing these three gaps by convening, challenging, and celebrating student leadership for dignity of people and planet. We will meet students where they are at, utilizing our core curriculum refined over the past 5 years to help existing student leaders convene locally, campus by campus. Through these convenings over a semester, students will be trained in hard and soft skills, learning how to write budgets and business plans and manage their respective teams. These students, our Millennium Fellows, will have time and dedicated space to reflect on core values: empathy, humility, inclusion. Most importantly, the lived experiences of student leaders will guide the conversations. We will invite these students to take collective action to achieve the SDGs. Imagine one concrete example: fellows on a campus working with university administration, faculty, staff, and peers to create a campus-wide inclusion strategy, advancing SDG Target 10.2, ensuring students of all backgrounds on campus feel safe, feel secure, and are able to contribute to the community. With proven impact at the campus level, we will invite these students to plug into larger intercollegiate campaigns, the types of existing campaigns run by trusted organizations like SDS and Youth. And when students create impact locally and globally, we will recognize and celebrate their work by formally recognizing them as Millennium Fellows, a designation that will be known to universities, funders, and employers. Our goal is clear: to work with up to 20 Millennium Fellows on each campus, to give them access to training, connections, and recognition, and to do this with up to 100 campuses in 2018. And so my invitation to all of you in this room and to people watching around the world is, if you are an undergraduate leader advancing the SDGs, or if you know undergraduate networks, please connect them with us, because that's who we're looking for, that's who we want to be supporting in building their capacity to affect change. If students form grassroots communities grounded in ethical, collaborative leadership, they can live out what Pope Francis calls upon us all to make real. In a profound declaration in Laudato Si', Pope Francis shares this truth, quote, "The feeling of asphyxiation brought on by densely populated residential areas is countered if close and warm relationships develop, if communities are created, if the limitations of the environment are compensated for in the interior of each person, who feels held within a network of solidarity and belonging. In this way, any place can turn from being a hell on earth into a setting for a dignified life. Pope Francis powerfully affirms what I've spent a decade discovering, that if we help young people meaningfully engage in each community, in a local context, within a, quote, network of solidarity and belonging, we create the conditions for a, quote, dignified life. We will come so much closer to the vision Pope Francis outlines for us when we are deeply intentional in how we invest in grassroots youth organizing. So if I could make two special appeals to communities that can meaningfully support this work, they are these. One, to philanthropy. And I'm looking far beyond this room to all the leaders around the world in philanthropy. We need sizable investment in youth leadership, not solely a one-way relationship asking youth to support a particular cause, but also investing in the personal and professional growth of youth leaders as a worthy goal itself. Consider this fact. According to research by McKinsey, major foundations have donated just 1% of their funds to leadership development in the past 2 decades. Major foundations have donated just 1% of their funds to leadership development for this sector in the past 2 decades. Imagine what happens when we instead choose to prioritize investment in the potential of people, starting in their formative years. Imagine what that does to their spirit, to their resolve, and their commitment when they begin and for a lifetime after. I don't have to imagine, because I can tell you firsthand that's what happened to me. When leaders like you, Professor Sachs, chose to believe in me when I was 19, when you chose to mentor me and advise MCN, it gives me the resilience to carry on a decade later and make social impact a lifetime commitment. We need philanthropy to follow your lead, placing trust in a generation of youth leaders just as you did in me. To higher education. To higher education, we need you to meet demand. Many of you have seen the 2014 Gallup-Purdue Index, a survey of 30,000 recent college graduates that found only 3% had all 6 types of experiences during their undergraduate years that correlate with great lives and careers after graduation. To put it simply, there were 2 areas identified as the missing pieces in the undergraduate experience: mentorship and experiential education. Students are asking for support and avenues to engage. Whether you do this internally or seek external partners, consider embracing the agency of your students. Draw on the rich history of student activism. It has contributed to civil rights, the end of apartheid, the environmental movement, and so much more. Can you in higher education create space to help student leaders tap into their power? Can that be part of the DNA and ethos of your institution? With such an ethos and programming to support it, what kind of alumni can your institution cultivate for your community and for the world? And one thought I keep returning to that I wanted to share with youth leaders here in this room and far beyond. May we be both humble and resolute. We all have so much to learn from our elders and from each other. Humility is our greatest tool to learn from the history and environment that shape us. And let us be resolute, knowing that we have real value to share, that whatever gaps we have in lived experience, we can compensate for. In the words often shared by you, Sam Lonnie, in quote, enthusiasm, idealism, and creativity. And so I am here to be a resource, if I can be, to every young leader and every leader in this room and far beyond, with the hope that I can learn from each of you as well. For all undergraduates, MCN is a resource for you, and I invite you to join our community. And I would be remiss if I did not recognize the extraordinary leadership of our partners at SDSN Youth for being a transformative network in this space. I'm also here in my advisory capacity, advising the executive director of UN Women. There is no question that women young and old face systemic sexism and oppression. We all know this, and I won't mansplain what is not my lived experience. but I want to offer UN Women as a resource. And for all young people, and all young people of faith, to know that UN Women is especially keen to work with you, and I would love to help connect the dots. As a young man, I have fallen short. I have made mistakes. And my time with UN Women has taught me that in particular, all of us identifying as male in this room and beyond have significant work to do to uphold the dignity of all genders. I am grateful to UN Women for leading on this work and spotlighting resources like Men Care and the Barbershop Toolbox to help us learn more. And I hope that for all of us youth of faith, for anyone here who identifies of a faith, that we can work at the nexus of feminism and faith to ensure our worship affirms our values. If anyone doubts that belief and investments in youth leadership are worthwhile, let me offer you one final example. It seems particularly fitting at the Vatican to reflect on my nation's history and on a transformative young individual of the Catholic faith who overcame discrimination to leverage youth leadership for the globe. At a time of anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States, the young, visionary John F. Kennedy became president. In his short life, he transformed millions more. President Kennedy and his colleague, Sergeant Shriver, created the Peace Corps. This idea at the time was mocked as a, quote, juvenile experiment and a, quote, kiddie corps. That small idea has led to over 200,000 Americans at an average age of 28 years old, engaging with communities in 139 nations, transforming the social fabric of our nation and its relationship with our world. In his inaugural address, President Kennedy called on all Americans to ask what they can do for our country. He called on all people to commit to the freedom of humanity. But in words perhaps lesser known from his inaugural address, he shared a charge almost unquestionably informed by faith. Quote, if a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich. May we realize that we are all interconnected, sharing our common home. And that when we are able to see each other, we find ourselves. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sam, this is incredible. Thank you. Our next speaker is Ala Murabit. Ala, a medical doctor, is one of the 17 UN SDG global advocates, a United Nations high-level commissioner for health, employment, and economic growth, a TED speaker, founder of Voices of Libyan Women, co-founder of Omnis Institute and an MIT Media Lab Director's Fellow. She was recently named a 2017 Forbes 30 Under 30 and Aspen Institute Spotlight Health Scholar for her work in global health policy, and a Harvard University Law 2017 Women Inspiring Change. Her TED Talk was named TED Talk of the Day and one of 4 moving TED Talks to watch right now by the New York Times. She currently serves as a trustee for the Malala Fund, International Alert, Malaria No More, Keeping Children Safe, and as an advisor to Connect Her. Named the New York Times International Trust Women Hero 2014, Ala is an Ashoka Fellow, and Ala is the Yanis Marisa Belarsario International Humanitarian Award recipient, and Newsweek 2025 Under 25 to Watch, a BBC News 100 Top Women, the 2015 Safe Global Hero, and a Virgin Unite Changemaker.
Hi, everyone. So I am going to change it up a little bit and do about 3 minutes where I'm going to just go over a brief overview of what I've done and what I think the Sustainable Development Goals have meant in my work. And then I'm kind of going to open the floor for discussion and questions and conversation. And feel free to ask whatever you want. I will take questions ranging from what's the best flavor of ice cream to what's the best goal to work on. I promise to answer them all as honestly as I can in my own opinion. So I was born and raised in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan in Canada, and I lived there until I was 15 when I finished high school and I moved to Libya, which is a neighboring country of Italy, so not too far from here. Our food is as delicious, if not more so. You should come check it out. And I started medical school there. When I was 21, I founded an organization called the Voice of Libyan Women, which focused on women's political participation and more directly women's inclusion in security and peace processes, because I noticed that oftentimes in countries of conflict and post-conflict, if women are not included at the time of nation building and really peace building, they're not going to be included down the line. It's a much more difficult, and you can kind of envision it like building an infrastructure system, right? It's easier to build something new than it is to tear something old down and put something else there. So the idea was to ensure that women are included from the very beginning. Our campaigns, like the Noor campaign, are now replicated globally and have been cited by the UN as campaigns which work and which create significant social change and legal change. And everybody on our team, unsurprisingly, was under the age of, I'd say, 25, 30. There is an echo. It's annoying. Like, I think my voice is great, but I definitely don't want to hear it twice. So everybody, no, what is under the age of 25 when we started, everybody is still under the age of 30, sorry. And in 2015, I ended my tenure as president. I'm still on the board, but I started another organization and a women's mentorship program. And the mentorship program is predominantly for minority women who would like access into the public policy space on a global level. And that's because a lot of young minority women are doing some pretty kick-ass stuff locally, and they don't have the same I say pathway, or the same very visible pathway that a lot of young men do. And so it became, and it continues to be, probably the cause that is most dear to my heart. And from the success of that and from the work we've done there, we started the Omnis Institute, which focuses on leadership, mentorship, and capacity building, as well as learning from local leaders on 4 key areas, which are migration, trafficking, security, and international engagement. And I'm also the executive director of Phase -1, which is focused specifically on security and inclusive and comprehensive security solutions, and challenging ideas like the securitization of health or migration. So if you guys can think of almost any crisis in the past 20 years, usually it'll be the war on poverty, or the war on drugs, or the war on Ebola, or the war on refugees, right? And it's this securitized rhetoric which really challenges our ability to actually create peace rather than kind of just fend off temporary conflict. So I also have the pleasure, along with Jeff, of being one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goal global advocates. And I often do not use the term Sustainable Development Goals because they are a mouthful. And everybody I work with just understands global goals a lot better. But it is, for me, they have been for me, I think. So the SDGs are interesting. I have started a local organization in a conflict country. I know it's not a reality to go to people who are trying to make sure they get their food and water and tell them, hey, these sustainable development goals are super legit, you should start working on them. By the same token, they've been a great source of community for me, in the sense that they've given me kind of a piece of paper that I can get into certain rooms with and say, listen, you've made promises, you have to adhere to them. And it's something that I was able to do when I was younger with Resolution 1325, which, for those of you who don't know, is Women, Peace, and Security. It was barely implemented and continues not to be implemented well enough on the ground, but having that documentation, having that public and that political support meant that I could use it to access rooms and meetings and spaces of influence. And so I think the SDGs, in my experience, have been used very similarly by a lot of the organizations that I've seen and worked with. And I think my question to all of you, and what I'll start the discussion off with, is yesterday when I spoke to you guys privately or hearing in the public panels, there wasn't a lot of commentary on how, if you've been able to leverage the SDGs in your work, and if it's been successful. And if not, why? Like, what can we do to make it more applicable locally? Or do you think it doesn't necessarily work in your particular context? And I'll turn it over to you guys, and you guys can discuss.
Thank you, Ala. So please raise your hand if you could reflect on, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. Just to answer your question, so I spent some time in Niger, and I usually use Niger as a country because being an African, I've never ever seen the level of poverty that I saw in Niger. Niger has a population of 17 million people. 50% of that population is under 25. 89% of the girls would marry off before their 15th birthday, and 17% of the girls are, only 17% of the girls are literate. And when I was going to Niger, it was when Boko Haram had attacked neighboring Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. It was a very scary moment. And the time I spent in Niger, I saw these young girls, all, going about their daily activities. Get up in the morning, carry water, or go to the farms, while the boys would, take the animals to the mountains. And I was asking myself, when we talk about the SDGs, are we just talking about, something on paper? How do we leverage the SDGs to help these people who will be left behind? It's for sure. We cannot yet say that.
So what's the answer you came up with?
I couldn't. And I couldn't because the institutions in these parts of the world are not legit. The institutions, the government, is doing nothing. And we cannot, for decades, be expecting support coming from outside of Africa. It has to be within these countries. And if these countries cannot support...
So I'm asking you, what are your ideas? I get it. I'm from Africa. I got you. What are your ideas? What's the plan? The country has signed on to the SDGs, right?
Yes.
There is a regional body, multiple regional bodies, which engage in Africa. So tell me, as a young leader, what's your plan?
To start, I would say education. That's the plan. Because, you want to say something?
That's an idea, but what's the plan? Education, give me a strategy. If I am a young woman in your country and I'm saying, listen, I want education, I want access, and the government has signed on to a plan, to an agenda, they have made international promises. What, as a young leader that has access, that has education, that has capability, that can be in places like this, what's your plan?
Good question.
I know, I'm brilliant.
Yeah, so I would say it has to start with awareness. And by awareness, I would say that, we as young people, we need to speak up. And the plan is not going to the government and telling them we need the services, but the plan is making sure that we are part of the decision-making process of those institutions that we see each day. It's somehow a little bit difficult because freedom of speech is It's a big problem in this part of the world. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's a very, very complicated question. So,
That's fair. I'm glad you're thinking about it, though. That's what matters.
Please.
En español, ¿ok? Algunas veces yo tengo la impresión que nosotros no tenemos formación suficiente sobre los ODS para multiplicar esto en nuestros países. La mi pregunta es muy simple. ¿Qué la ONU puede hacer para formarnos un poco más como líderes? Formación. No digo que nosotros hagamos un evento como este para hablarnos, pero para escucharnos de ustedes, porque yo tengo realmente la impresión que nosotros no sabemos de los ODS. Yo he aprendido ahora mismo de profesor Jeffrey otro ODS que yo no sabía, es muy importante para mi país, sobre la corrupción. Entonces, la mi pregunta, ¿qué la ONU puede hacer para formarnos como líderes? Nosotros tenemos que tener formación. No es suficiente que nosotros vengamos aquí y hablamos para ustedes. Tenemos que escuchar de ustedes. Entonces, ¿qué puedes hacer para formarnos más, para que podamos multiplicar estas informaciones en nuestros países?
I feel I also want to kind of reinforce into that. I come here and I feel that it is only because coming here and hearing from you and being to several MUNs, I can more or less understand the language in which the UN talks and the language in which you express, but it is a whole vocabulary and it is a whole perspective and vision about the world. And sometimes I feel a little frustrated when having to engage in certain communities where people don't even know, sometimes we face victims of human trafficking that haven't even heard the word victims or trafficking. And I have to explain those as well to them, to the police officers, so that they can pick up their complaint. And so coming here, I understand now because of this session that we are part of the SDSN Youth Network. But sometimes I do not know how to use that tool. I don't even know how much I'm allowed to say what or how to explain it. And how much can we actually bring that as being ambassadors for the network? I just don't know how to use the tool, but I feel that's conversations I've had with other people. It's a little bit about that, about actually just not knowing how to use that amazing tool that we've been talking about.
¿Puedo hacer una sugestión? Una rápida sugestión. Yo no sé si es posible, pero en otra ocasión, juntarnos para formarnos, no solamente para que hablemos, más que nos formen para que nosotros podamos multiplicar esto. Formación. Es importante que nosotros hablemos. Yo creo en esto, claro. Nosotros tenemos que hablar, nosotros tenemos que presentar nuestros proyectos. Yo estoy totalmente de acuerdo con esto. Pero en otra ocasión, yo pienso que sería importante que un simposio pudiese formarnos. Es esto.
Me? All right. Hello? Okay, we're good. Hey, guys. Well, in regards to education, I've been hearing about it since yesterday, and I wasn't going to speak until hopefully next year if I was invited again, but it seems like this seems to be the appropriate place. Basically, in Dubai, we're trying to build up an initiative where we're going to make a Dubai pilot project in regards to education for community service learning, integrated and paired with SDG learning. So you've got the theory of SDG learning, where people will learn in each individual classroom from middle school all the way to undergrad and college. And obviously based on their age and skill level, they'll be able to do more with each SDG. And how they give back is through community service learning, which has actually been very well done in the States since, I believe, the early 2000s. If we can take both theory and action through the integration of community service learning, we can actually put sustainability within this initiative on a global scale. The reason I say Dubai as a pilot project is because it's one of the few cities in the world that has multiple curriculums, learning systems. American, British, French, Arabic, you name it, they're all over there in Dubai. And alhamdulillah, God bless, with our contacts in Dubai, we would be able to push this through, hopefully.
Okay, let's take one more and then.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask about the importance of mentorship and the actual way in which we can implement it. I ask this because, as my colleagues were saying, it is not really common to find on the ground important knowledge about the SDGs, and also it is really hard for people we probably work with, and even for us, to find figures that can be role models. I talk about this, again, as a woman in science, and I'm pretty sure you can see it as a physician. It is really, really hard to see women in our fields that have managed to get to positions in which they can be an important figure and an agent of change. And my question is, what do you think, in your experience, is the best way to be a mentor? Because, as Sam was mentioning earlier, it is really important for important personalities to invest in the youth. But I don't think right now I'm, for example, in the peak of my career, but I do have a degree in STEAM, and that's a complete different story to the majority of the girls from my home country in Mexico. So I think, I'm pretty sure I was the first Latin American on graduating from the physics department of my university. And that was really hard because I never found a person that I could see and say, oh yeah, she did it, it is possible, I can do it. So,
You be your own role model. You sound like a role model to me.
Yeah, exactly. So if now I want to go to other girls and say, you can do this, let's do it together, what's the best way to do it? It's just talk
Just show up.
Just show up or do something more.
Well, I mean, you have to do something once you get there. But what I'm saying is you have the credibility to show up and say, look, I've managed to do this. You have more credibility than anybody else to a young woman who's interested in STEM in your community, right? Like, you literally are the embodiment of what she would like to achieve. So I think the challenge, at least for me, I never had a mentor. I did, in the sense of I had women I look up to who I think have done incredible, incredible, incredible work. But in terms of them being in my field, not necessarily. In terms of them being able to open up doors for me, not necessarily. The vast majority of people I work with, given that I work in security and global development, are about 50 to 60-year-old white men. So there's not very many people who look or sound or think like me in the room, which, you know, is a double-edged sword. I've learned a lot because of it, but I've also wished oftentimes to have other women in the room. And I learned pretty early on the only way you get other women in the room is if you're already in that space, you open that door. And that means you going maybe to universities and to high schools where you know young girls might be interested in this but might think it's tough, and saying, listen, this is my email, reach out if you want to talk to me, or here's my phone number, send me a text message. And it can start off very, very informally. That's how my mentorship program started off. It was very much, if you have a question, feel free to ask, don't feel ashamed to, right? And I'm not saying, listen, I don't think anybody is a mentor in the sense that they have all the answers. I don't think I have all the answers, and I'm sure a lot of the people who've worked with me and my mentees who Jeff's met when they've come to UNGA for the past couple of years will tell you that I've messed up a time or two. But I think that's part of mentorship. I think letting people see you fail and recognize that it's hard work and that you're showing up despite the fact that you might not know the terminology and you might not have, you know, all the answers. I think that's part of it. But show up. Tell them, listen, I've done this, I'm here, and it's not, because, you know, for a lot of young women, merely the fact that you exist and you've been able to do it and you continue to do it, despite societal pressures, is more than enough. And you'll find a lot of people come into their own when they recognize that there are other women in that space who have kind of dominated or at least done what they have in it, right? To cover the other questions real quick, what can the UN do to train us to be leaders? I have a very controversial opinion on leadership, and that's that I don't think everybody is innately a leader. I don't. I think everybody can be a leader, but I think that takes a little bit of self-initiative. I don't think the UN can go and teach everybody who wants to change the world. That's not what the UN has capacity to do. The UN wouldn't even know I exist if I didn't show up. When I was 21, the UN was staying in a compound in Tripoli in Libya. I don't come from Tripoli. I live in a city about 45 minutes away called Zawiya, and they hadn't come. So I went to the hotel, and I found a group of men sitting in suits eating lunch, and I introduced myself, assuming they were important because they were men sitting down eating lunch, and they turned out to be the UN. And that's how they knew about me. And I have never, when it comes to terminology, I mean, I felt really out of place for the first 5. I still feel out of place in a lot of UN meetings because they use a lot of terminology that I don't use. But the reality is, I know the reality on the ground. And that's basically what you have to show up, recognizing that you are the leader. You are the expert in the room. It doesn't matter if somebody comes and says they're an expert on trafficking because they've done some research. You're equally an expert because you've seen what it looks like on the ground. And that's what you contribute. You don't need to know the terminology. Speak in your own terminology because that's the only way things change. We can't keep playing dress up and assuming that we're gonna. That's not our job, right? Our job is to say, listen, you need us because we have experience and we have knowledge that you don't have. That's the bottom line. And in order for us to really have that conversation legitimately, then you need to have the substance of the information. So you need to know what the SDGs are. The UN doesn't need to train you on that. You can go online, find them, find the resources. If you want to be a leader, you take the time, you sit down, you say, listen, if you're going to take the responsibility of being in your community and having ownership over projects and going to local schools and going to local leaders and going to your ministers and talking to them, then you need to know your stuff. So sit down, learn the SDGs. If there are specific questions you have, there are a million, other than the classes they've done on the SDGs, there are a million resources. You want to learn how to write a grant? It's there. You want to find a mentor? Go online, find somebody who you think is really, really intense and smart and knows all of their stuff, and send them an email, even if it's a cold email. Reach out and say, listen, I have some ideas, I have some questions, I need some help, right? And there's no problem there. That's how I've met most of the people I think have been great resources to me. But the reality is, no one is gonna come and say, hey, do you wanna be a leader? Let me train you. I don't think that's realistic, and I don't think it's very sustainable. I mean, let's be blunt. There is not a lot of incentive for young people to be engaged in this space. Most of us, if you're in university or you're just recently out of university, you are trying to build your own life. Pretty soon, some of you may have debt, some of you may not. Some of you may want to buy a house, some of you may want to pay off your car, some of you might want to get married and have kids in a few years. Some of you guys might want to travel like all your buddies, right? And this does not pay very well. There's not a lot of awesomeness here in terms of incentive. There isn't. A lot of you who have gotten degrees in economy could probably go and make 3 times as much as bankers. I mean, that's the reality, right? So at some point, I think you have to ask yourself, why am I here? Why did you fly to Rome? What were you coming for? What do you need to stay engaged? And if your answer is, I need training, that's a real easy fix, right? We can do online courses. I'm sure SDSN can get enough of you guys to say, listen, we need a training, and you'll do a training. Will that be enough? Is that what will keep you engaged? And I see people nodding their head no. So what is it? What makes the SDGs relevant in your work? Because I don't think it's one training. I don't even think it's multiple trainings. A lot of organizations have tried that locally. So what is it? And you all can think about it. It's not a return and if you come up with something, let me know. But be honest with yourself. Is it like Sam said? Do you guys need better paychecks? Do you guys need more support? Do you guys need jobs? Do you guys need authority? What is it? And come up with substantial things where you can create an actual blueprint for engagement so that there is a connected network of young leaders that A, are engaged, but B, know their own thresholds, know what their interests are, and know how they can best engage in the SDGs in the long term, because this is 13 years, right? The last thing is, how can we use the tools as a toolbook, is what I wrote. So I don't work for SDSN, so I have no idea what the SDSN toolbook is. Is that a thing? Okay, well, I wrote, okay, well, maybe there should be. Maybe that's what they're trying to tell you. There needs to be a toolbook of, I don't know, young leaders, guide to transform the world or something. Listen, what I picked up from your question was that some of the people you work with don't know what the SDGs are. They don't even know the terminology of trafficking, et cetera, et cetera. I agree with you on that. In Libya, we never used the term SDGs when we did our public campaigns. We never used Resolution 1325 when we did our public campaigns. We actually used ending the cycle of violence and family and community building when we spoke to people in the public, and we used a lot of the political terminology to get access to political leaders who had the ability to ensure that our public campaigns were more successful because we were allowed in schools and given free media, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you have different conversations with different groups. The same way you would say one thing to your parents and you say another thing to your professor and you say another thing to your friends. They can all have the same meaning. At the end of the day, you have the same value and you have the same purpose. But it's really about recognizing that if you're going to go into a community where 90% aren't literate, talking to them about something called the Sustainable Development Goals is going to be more or less irrelevant to them. If you're going to go into a community that's in conflict, that has very little respect or trust for the UN, telling them the Sustainable Development Goals are in their interest is going to be irrelevant. So I don't think it's necessarily that you have to use the terminology all the time. It's about knowing that the terminology and the platform is there for you to access and leverage when and if needed. Right? And recognizing that there's a community of people working on the SDGs. So you might be working in your country on trafficking with people who don't know what it means, but maybe you can leverage another young woman working in her own country on trafficking to create some sort of public support or some sort of engagement. And a lot of that can be done through people you meet because they're working on the SDGs. Do you understand what I'm saying? So I think it's very much about leadership and knowing what's the language you use when.
Thank you, Ala. We will go back to questions afterwards. We still have time for general discussion. And now I would like to introduce our last but not least, Sam Loney, who probably needs no introduction by now. So Sam is, apart from being the founder of Sustainable Development Solutions Network Youth Initiative, and serving as global coordinator, a mentor of mine. Sam has mobilized thousands of young people globally to engage with the Sustainable Development Goals and has helped initiate several global programs, including the Local Pathways Fellowship, the Global Schools Program, and the Youth Solutions Report. Sam also works as a project officer with the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, one of the leading interdisciplinary research and education institutes for sustainable development around the globe. While at university, Sam co-founded the Monash International Affairs Society and later convened the world's biggest student conference, Harvard World Model United Nations, which brought 2,000 students from 85 countries to Melbourne to tackle the leading global issues. He has served as an advisor to several prominent working groups, including the Albach-Luxembourg Group, CSIRO National Outlook Project, and the Australian Government's Innovation Exchange Program. He is also a contributor to the Huffington Post and News 24 and was recently recognized as a young peace builder by the Nobel Peace Prize Forum for his work. Sam.
Thank you, Anna. Let me tell you, it is not easy to speak after Sam Vagar and Ala Morabit. It's not easy, and they didn't make it any easier anyway. But I'm going to try. So, today I'm going to share with you my story and my journey, I guess, to leadership. I come from Australia, Melbourne. But I had a different upbringing to most Australian children. I was born in Tehran, in Iran, into a middle-class family. with ordinary parents, attended an ordinary primary school. But you see, nothing in particular about my life, and in particular my parents, was ordinary. You see, when they were in their 20s, both my parents, mom and dad, were imprisoned and tortured for daring to speak the truth. Simple as that. When I was 10 years old, my family was forced to flee the country of my birth in fear of arrest and persecution. And we went to Pakistan through this perilous journey through the desert on the way there. And as soon as we arrived in Pakistan as refugees, and that's where I first heard the term UN, United Nations. Soon after we arrived there, September 11 happened. I remember looking at the news of September 11, those horrific moments, and the sadness I felt, and it was horrific to see. But I would have never imagined that the events that took place in New York would come into my community and would basically decimate some of the societies that we were living in. Because soon after the United States government, the United States military invaded Afghanistan and Afghanistan, and a lot of the Taliban fled into Pakistan. And we saw a cycle of violence and incredible instability. In fact, on 2 separate occasions, our house, we lived in a house where there were different people in the flat upstairs and some in the basement below. And on 2 separate occasions, our house was attacked by extremists. So, going from an ordinary society into one fueled by violence was not easy, and the trauma has always been there with me and my sibling, my younger brother. And life wasn't easy either. We didn't have much money. We didn't have enough money to purchase or afford books or healthcare, many other things. And me and my brother were only able to attend school because my mother went and begged the school principal in the school nearby, Ganhara Public School, a school I will forever be indebted to let us study there, to have an education. Life wasn't easy, but compared to other people's life in that part of the world, compared to the people who lived just down the road from us, we lived like kings. Because just down the road, there were children diving into rubbish bins, picking up the food that was left behind by richer folk who just also lived just across from there. But nothing, I think, was more haunting than the cries and several scenes where I saw young mothers who lost their children to preventable diseases. Those images and their howls and their tears haunt me to this day. Eventually, we got accepted as migrants and we moved to Australia after 4 years of living in Pakistan. And of course, starting as a young Australian starting out in the new society wasn't easy, especially because at that time the Australian military was in 2 military campaigns, one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq, and Iran's down the middle. And there was a lot of racism and it was difficult. And when I look back, I realized that After what I went through as a child, it would have been so easy to get lost. It would have been so easy to get lost. But there was something that kept me together. There was something that kept me on course. And I think those were the lessons that my parents taught me, the inspiration I drew from them, and the things they taught me about life. That's what kept me together. Despite being damaged souls from what they'd experienced, they taught me to love, be courageous, especially in the face of life's most difficult challenges, but also to care for your fellow human being, to not be indifferent to their suffering. And I can't do their mentorship any justice. I can't really capture it in several words. It's hard, but I'm going to try, not through my own words, but through the words of a famous Persian poet, Sa'di, from 12th century BC in Iran. And he said this: human beings are members of a whole, in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, uneasy, the rest will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. These were the words, and these is the mentorship lessons that I took from my parents, and it helped keep me together. And in a recent interview, I was actually asked, why do you do what you do? And I had to think about that. Why do I do what I do? And as Allah put it, the question to ask yourself, why am I here? Why am I doing this? And for me, I'm doing it because our planet has entered into a new geological epoch, known as the Anthropocene. Because each year, we move more sediments than all the riverways and all the seas combined. Because 90% of plant activity happens where humans have a significant impact. We've been on the surface of this planet for less than 1% of its history, but we have changed the planet and the evolution of it so far that we are now in a new geological epoch. Because we are in the middle of the 6th mass extinction, where we're losing species faster than any time in history. Because we have almost over the carbon budget, and some governments decide in this time to pull out of agreements that are providing a lifeline to future generations. Because our indifference is threatening the planet. Because climate change is not something that is far and into the future. It's having an impact today. Even on conflicts. Look at Syria, where climate change, the impacts of climate change help and contributed and help trigger a violent conflict, a war. Well, it overnight reverts decades of development and funding and aid and investments in infrastructure. $200 billion worth of damage to the resources and to the economy there. The average life expectancy went from 76 years to 55 years in a space of 3 years. And 4 out of 5 Syrians now live in poverty, with millions displaced. That's the reality. That's what climate change is doing today. And of course, similar conclusions have been drawn about Darfur. So 2 of the most intense conflicts of the past decade have been in part triggered by the impacts of climate change. I do what I do because there are 1 billion people on this planet who still live on less than $1.25 a day. Because 1 million people went to bed hungry last night. Because millions of children are out of school. Because women and girls are valued less in many societies, and there's systematic discrimination against them. How is that fair? How is that fair when you look at the recent Oxfam report that says 8 people, 8 men, own as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people on this planet? How is that fair? How is that fair when there are still 1 billion people living on less than $1.25 a day? Not when their wealth can put many of these people out of suffering. And these are the facts. Nothing's going to change them. These are the facts. This is why I do what I do. Because not only is it a responsibility, but it's also an opportunity to become the generation that leads the way, that helps change a lot of these things. And when looking at such daunting prospects, I guess it's very easy to become disappointed. Look at these problems and say, wow, they're too big, they're too far away, and it can drain all the energy out of you. But you know, the thing that also keeps me going is the energy and inspiration I draw from this room. The inspiration I draw from people like Sam, sitting there, who's done such wonderful things, but is yet so humble. That inspires me. That gives me energy. What keeps me going is Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is tireless. Over the past 4 years that I've worked with him, I've seen him tirelessly work, go around the world, communicate the message, and not give up. That keeps me going. I draw my inspiration from Allah, where in challenging environments she was able to come on top as a young woman and help change things and become a voice for women at the United Nations and young people. I draw my inspiration from all of you, and there are too many stories to tell, but I draw my inspiration from all you. You are what gives me energy, because when I look at the problems that you face in your communities and how you were able to stand up to them and how you were able to care, that drives me. And if I were to draw on some of the principles and fundamental values that Pope Francis has talked about, is that we need to move forward with love and gratitude, because only then we can create a connection between people who are otherwise divided along cultural, national, linguistic, and social lines. We need to move forward with humility, because only then we can unleash our capacity to learn from each other and draw on the wisdom of all the generations. We need to move forward with generosity, because only then we can let go of preconceived notions of us and them, mine and yours. And these are the concepts that have imprisoned our mentality and have given rise to dictatorships, to false ideologies of libertarianism, protectionism, isolationism, and so on and so forth. And for me, these principles are the essence of the Sustainable Development Goals. Not only everything that I care about is captured within this framework, within these goals, but also it has outlined this exciting agenda. For me, the Sustainable Development Goals as an agreement is as important as the Human Rights Declaration was, in particular to the last century. Because it forces us to work together. It encourages us to work together. It brings us into this room. It gives us a common reference point. But also because world leaders and governments need benchmarks. They need benchmarks to be able to set policies to align themselves. And if we sit back, of course, they won't do much. To them, it's just a signature, an agreement. But if we speak out and we mobilize in an organized manner, then perhaps we can make a difference. For me, the SDGs are ambitious, because if you look at the wording and you have a read of the agreement, you'll realize, just look at it. They're very ambitious and good. We need that. 2, they're transformative. In UN talk, this means revolutionary. It means band-aid solutions are not meant to work. We have to completely reimagine the way we do things. And thirdly, they're inclusive. The official motto is leave no one behind. That's a big commitment. That's a big commitment. And for me, young people are particularly well placed to tackle them. Because, and I will substantiate this, for me, young people are incredibly idealistic. And that might be looked at in a negative way, but I think in this case, if we have an ambitious agenda, we need idealism to get there. We need it. To quote Mark Twain, they didn't know it was impossible, so they did it. Transformation we talked about. For me, young people are incredibly creative. And you can look at loads of research on the neurological processes that goes in the brain of younger people where they're more creative and how that creativity helps them. And as a famous Einstein said, you cannot solve problems with the same thinking that was used to create them. So if we want a transformation, we want this transformative agenda to take place, we need to capitalize on the creativity of young people who are able to think outside the box and reimagine our future. That's a second. And thirdly, numbers. More than 3.5 billion people on this planet are under the age of 30. So how can we be committed to leave no one behind if we don't consider them at the forefront of this movement? And don't get me wrong, young people are not the only stakeholders in this, but I believe fundamentally that through the creativity, idealism, and numbers of young people, and when that is matched in an intergenerational effort with the financial capacity, with the expertise, and with the influence of all the generations, that's when you get real results. So you can imagine my excitement when in early 2014, Professor Sachs came to me and said, we need to mobilize young people in the work of SDSN to try and make the SDGs at the forefront of their actions. It was an absolute honor, and just like Sam, Professor Sachs has mentored me and has been a supporter for many years. And I remember when we started SDSN Youth, our first meeting was under the staircase in Monash University. We grew 3 or 4 individuals. But today, we are a network of 140 team members from 40 different countries, 500 plus member organizations from 70 different countries. And together, we've established several projects like the Youth Solutions Report, because we believe that we need to identify local solutions by young people, tell those stories, and help replicate those. Because so many times I would go into meetings to talk and to young people, and they would say, well, what can I do? But now we have this list of 50 solutions that they can draw inspiration from. But also, we're working to try and establish a solutions fund, a global solutions fund for SDGs for young people. So they have access to the finances and the training and the soft skills, which Sam mentioned, to enable them to really unleash out there organizations and ideas that can make a difference along the SDGs. That's how we make the difference. Secondly, because as Professor Sachs said yesterday, in cities, we need mayors and we need local pathways that local governors can make in order to achieve the SDGs. And so we grabbed 60 individuals from 52 cities. We're training them to be able to do that, to make a transformation in local communities, and we are tracking their journeys so that we can replicate it elsewhere, to scale. Global schools, because we believe that the next generation needs to be trained and understand the challenges that they're stepping into. Because we want to plant that idea that they are coming into a world where there will be challenges and that we want to give them a chance. And we want to really make a difference through education in schools around the world. This is our commitment. And finally, mobilizing universities. STSN has 700 member universities. If we were to mobilize the students on those universities, we could make a real difference. But there are thousands of universities around the world. And I know young people, when I was a student, always looked outward, couldn't wait to get out of the university. But actually, it's the best place for things. It's the place where you gather with your friends and colleagues. It's a place where you have access to venue. I cannot tell you how hard it is to get venue when you're not within the university system. I took that privilege for granted. But universities have also got access to networks and their alumni. And finally, you have access to expertise, researchers, professors. And it's the place where I see it as a launching pad, this opportunity to look inwards and really mobilize campuses to achieve the goals, to capitalize on these. And so STSN Youth here is to support you, your efforts, whether it's in local cities, whether it's on campuses, whether it's in school settings, whether it's in your community creating a social business or a local youth organization. We're here to support you and help scale your efforts. Talk to me, push the team. We're here to make these things possible. And so grateful that the Vatican Youth Symposium enables these conversations to happen. To become a pioneer for a lot of these things when going forward. For me, it's the time for action, not just talk. Time for action. And Pope Francis talks about said we're living in a world with a globalization of indifference. Well, I refuse to be indifferent. I refuse to stand by and watch our planet decimated by climate change. I refuse to stand by and watch millions of people go hungry every night. I refuse to stand by and watch 8 people control half of the wealth on this planet while the rest suffer. And I refuse to accept this as a norm. And one thing I'm incredibly inspired by is that I have all of you, that I'm not alone in this journey. Other leaders who I can hold hands with, share stories, and do the hard work with, as we all strive in solidarity together for a more fraternal and supportive society. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Great. Thanks to all of you. Let me talk about action and how you can train and make some suggestions, but I'm still waiting for your plan by the end of the day. Very practical. It doesn't have to have too much preamble about why it's important. It has to be an action-oriented plan. The Sustainable Development Goals, because they combine a very wide range of issues, education, health, poverty, agriculture, urbanization, infrastructure, jobs, biodiversity. These are not easy. I've spent, I'd say, pretty much nonstop 45 years studying these issues now, and feel that it's endless. Every opening you have, there's more. So first you have to study. Now, I wrote a good textbook on this, which I really recommend. That's not because I recommend my textbook. I wrote it because there wasn't a textbook. So if you find another textbook you like, fine. But for the moment, the Age of Sustainable Development is meant, chapter by chapter, to help you understand what is the education issue, what is the health issue, what is the climate issue, what is the infrastructure issue. It was written in a very operational way. It's really meant so in a reading you can go topic by topic. There's an online course on the book, free, available, pleasant, I think, from what I've heard from a lot of people. Please, you must study these things. This is not self-evident. And what I'm doing in the textbook and in the video is channeling expertise, because what I learned a long time ago as a generalist is that the key is to be able to channel expertise, because each of these subjects has its own epistemic community. That means a community of high knowledge. And so if you want to understand malaria control, you better talk to the malariologists. If you want to understand AIDS, you better talk to the AIDS doctors. If you want to understand sustainable agriculture, you better talk to the agronomists. Not all of you can do that so easily. It's been my job for 20 years, precisely that. Empowered by the United Nations and Columbia University, organize specialist communities, listen to them, channel them, make proposals based on their knowledge. So I'm trying to give you a shortcut to get started. But there's ultimately nothing but lots of work ahead, because this is lifelong education, period, for anything. Anything you do is lifelong education. But there are no shortcuts, but we've given you a lot of tools to get started. And you may write to me anytime at sachs@columbia.edu, say I want more, or I don't understand why you said that, or I don't agree with this, and you'll hear back from me. Now, a second resource is your local universities. Please. Most are not organized around sustainable development right now, but some are. Those that are not should be. The reason they're not is that this is cross-faculty, this is cross-disciplinary. It takes a university effort to reorganize itself so that the agronomists are speaking to the public health specialists, are speaking to the engineers, are speaking to the economists. That's not how our universities are organized in general. But because of the challenges, they're reorganizing to facilitate these cross-disciplinary messages. Check out, if you're at a university, make sure you understand where the best locus of leadership is. Maybe there is a center for sustainability. Maybe there is an institute or someplace. If there's not, choose any of your advisors and go make an effort to recommend this kind of action. But they can be mentors to you. The knowledge is really important. I couldn't take a step forward on any of these topics without having credible, reliable experts that I can turn to, and I do every single day. I call them, I say, what does this mean in the newspaper? Why is it like this? Every day I'm asking my colleagues questions, because these are technical subjects that I cannot assess despite 45 years of working on them, unless I'm asking somebody who really knows. You don't have that network yet, but you probably have advisors and you have SDSN to help you. That's the purpose. The fundamental purpose of SDSN is knowledge-led development, if I could put it in one sentence. Because without that, we can have all the goodwill in the world, but we're not going to solve the problems. The goodwill should lead us to the knowledge that we need to solve the problems. Okay, so that's the first point, is you must learn. You must know where to turn. You must get some help. You should use SDSN as a resource. That's why it exists. It exists as a network. And every day I say to my colleagues in the network, how do we strengthen as a network? Not as 20 people writing articles in New York or Paris or someplace, but as a network, because that's the point of this thing. That's the only point of it. This is to empower you, but it cannot work unless you're taking it on. You don't have to be experts in everything, but you should appreciate that there is expertise in everything. Don't speak about things you don't know about, except to try to learn. The world doesn't need lots of people faking it. We could have a world of Donald Trumps, all yelling at each other. Okay? So please, this is really important. Second is organization. I want all of you to have two roles. You're leading your own organizations, but I want you to lead an SDG effort in your communities in some way. That can be an SDSN youth chapter. It can be an SDG chapter for your cities. It can be based at the university if you are. But that goes beyond your own organization. That's a responsibility for building something that is general. I'm a creature of universities. I stepped into a university in 1972. I've never stepped out of a university. So 45 years I've been a student. God forbid I should get a job. But I like universities. They have people of lots of different skills. They have intergenerational. We're a bit separated from all of the commercial pressures, not entirely, but a bit. So I really like universities as places to do this work. If that's convenient for you, I strongly recommend it. Strongly recommend it. If you're still affiliated but a little bit outside, if you're at the hospital but your university is nearby, go partner with them, because this is what universities should do around the world. So it's good for them, and it's a good base of operation. What does organization mean? It means, first, you're taking on the goals as a whole. Second, you're taking them on in action-oriented ways. That can start, by the way, with the campus being more sustainable. That's useful. You learn, should we have solar panels here? Should we have, what should we do with water treatment? What should we do with our waste management? That, by the way, is good for the community, good for students, good for student projects, good for the university self-discipline, and also educational, because there's nothing like solving problems to learn about problem solving. You cannot learn about problem solving in theory. You have to learn about it in practice. So the campus is one place. Second, the issues of if you happen to be lucky to be at a university that has an endowment, that's not so many, but some of them do, then working on the responsible management of the endowment is absolutely appropriate. Divestment issues, for example, very important. It combines the moral, the financial, and the analytical all together, so it's a very good thing to do. Third, cities. Work on cities. You're not at a stage in your career when you can run your countries, when you can advise the world, but you can absolutely...
Yeah, they are, Jeff.
No, they're not.
Yeah, they are.
No, they're not. They need experience, and you need practical experience. Get your cities on the SDGs. Get your communities on the SDGs. Solve local problems where you have the authority because you're the relative experts on that. Gain experience. Prove your success. Go to a province, go to a state. It's important, step by step, because all of this takes a lot of learning and a lot of experience and a lot of hard knocks and some failures to actually learn how this works. And the cities are wonderful places. This is where most of the world lives now. And cities are complicated. They're really organic organisms, as we know. They are full societies. They have problems of energy, of water, of transport, of jobs, of inequality, of biodiversity, of natural hazards, of climate change, of unfairness, of violence. They have all 17 Sustainable Development Goals within them. So what better way? I always tell my students, walk outside, ask where the electric poles come from, ask how the sewage is treated. You're living in an economy. Don't look at the stupid textbook alone. You're in the middle of one. So this is your city that can really help you to see, what is this about? Not everything can be solved at the city level because this is the subsidiarity idea. Certain problems can be solved at the city level, other problems at a national level, still other problems at the global level. But start at the cities as practical problem solvers. You'll earn your ticket to solve other problems. The more you solve, the more you've earned your way to solve further problems. That is just the nature of problem solving also. If you're lucky that you're invited in to solve something that is first time and thanks God it works, okay, that's good for you. If you do something and it's a disaster because you had no proper place to be there, it's not so good. So really be ready, trained, prepared as best you can. You'll gain experience constantly, over and over. Everything in life builds. And so you'll be able to use this. So I would really emphasize the local areas. Your mayors have never heard of the Sustainable Development Goals, unless they're really unusual. But most of them have not. But if you show them, they say, that's what I do every day. Say, yes, but by joining forces with other urban networks, with SDSN, with the United Nations, with SDG advocates, we can help this city to solve problems. And do you know, Madam Mayor, do you know, Mr. Mayor, we could put in solar panels, we could do this, or we could do that. Finally, let me say one word about Niger. okay? Because it's a good case. Niger is perhaps the poorest place in the whole planet. Probably the most desperate or certainly within the poorest 5 places on the planet. Okay. Why? There are a lot of intrinsic reasons why. One is it's landlocked. 2 is it's hyper-arid. Already those 2 account for a lot. Third, for a lot of reasons of extreme poverty, extreme isolation, colonial history, neglect, it has had decades of impoverishment and disempowerment of women, of course, and child marriage, and a fertility rate of 7, just about the highest in the world. And that has meant that the population has increased 10 times from 1950 till now, from about 2.5 million to about 25 million by 2020. 10 times in the middle of a desert, isolated, no ports, no infrastructure, no electricity. So this is a desperate situation, absolutely desperate. The whole Sahel is like that. There's no use in yelling at the government alone, because the average income is $375 per person. If you collect 20% of that in taxes, and you'd be lucky to do it, that's $75 per person per year. For what? For electrification, water, roads, communications, healthcare, education. $75. So either the world helps Niger or disaster continues. That's a major reality. And that's why we have to actually have a hard-headed understanding. It's one of the toughest places in the world, by far. And yelling will not solve it. You need electrification. Thank God for photovoltaics, because for the first time, Niger could actually have electricity. Thank God for telecommunications, because thanks God for the first time, a landlocked place 1,000 miles from a port could actually be connected to the world and to markets. 2 huge advantages. But one needs a strategy. I can tell you, this is, my work for 40 years, that place is tough. So we need a strategy. And that's what the role of the SDGs there is to say, these are everybody's goals, but Niger can't possibly meet them on their own. So that's why I spent the day in Brussels, exactly on that point. That's why we're going to mobilize philanthropy, but what we need from Niger is from the government and society, because there's a civil society, is we need to get these done, and with help, we will take leadership and ownership to do that, but we know it cannot be done on its own. And so that's the partnership that needs to be forged. And Niger is a wonderful